This is an old farm field that we're standing on, and it's at this point it looks, you can see how it would have been a farm field because things are open. The reality is 10 years ago there was lots of brush, lots of other trees. It was just kind of an overgrown set of whatever had emerged after it stopped being farmed in the 1980s. And so Bill Minter, the land manager, has worked at a whole set of projects here. So off in the distance to the east, you can see a wetland, some open water in it. You see a lot of tree snags that are down in the wet area that have drowned because of the water level, which is part of the intent. So he found that area where he could create a little bit of a diking system, and then as a result you have a wetland that develops and creates a habitat for all kinds of creatures, waterfowl, amphibians, macroinvertebrates, and then all the surrounding animal creatures in the ecosystems that will make contact with that. This ends up being an important project to do because by putting in a wetland here, it improves the water quality of the lakes that are here. So Bear Lake is off to this direction. High Lake we just were seeing over here. Bear Lake is here. So that's where the Fish and Wildlife programs will help to sponsor a project like this. What we're standing on here is now what's called a savanna. So you notice that we have these sparsely spaced oak trees. So it's creating this amazing savanna setting. All of what you see here has been seeded. You can see the remnants of the burn that happened about 3 weeks ago. So the charred bits of the grass here that was growing up. But you see other vegetation starting to poke up through and will just really become quite strong and vibrant in the coming weeks. As we look across to the west side of us is another restoration project which was actively tilled up until about 2004, when the rotation of corn and soybeans and hay that had been happening for decades was taken out, and we came in and planted this with native grasses and flowers. So you see the dead vegetation upper structure from the last season. The new growth will start to emerge through that. Fire will be introduced into that next year as one of the management practices. So we don't burn all of our restored areas at the same time. So where we're standing here was burned this year, that'll get burned next year. And that creates a health in the habitat. So when you have a fire, it's hot, it's fast, it makes the prairie systems, the grasses and flowers, much stronger. But it does mean that it has some impact on some levels of the insect population. It could kill off some snakes that are in there. It could kill off some mice that are in there. Some of them will flee and scurry out of the way, but they don't all. But by having parcels done, that means things can migrate over there, or that set of species can be the regenerative to send new creatures back over here again. And so we don't watch all of that happening, except we do know that it happens because we can see the vibrancy in all of that change.
Do you want to say more about the little mice that you're killing along the way?
the little mice. Like, none of them are my personal friends, so I don't know what to say about them. I haven't chatted with them lately.
we won't dwell on that.
What about...
It is actually an interesting question to think about when we are players in restoration. So we philosophically, in a land management perspective, believe that we need to be active in the land management versus passive, just see what happens. So for example, I was mentioning what this looked like 10 years ago. and one could say generally it was a mess because it was just all kinds of brambles and brushy stuff. Not that those are bad species, but it was not a healthy system. The reason that it ended up that way is it just was what happens when you've disturbed a landscape a lot and it lost its vibrancy, and it's a long journey for it to recover. It just, there are remnant things around that can help that happen, but we realize that we as humans have had a huge impact on this. So let's invest some of our energy back into helping the ecosystem have greater resilience in its own way. So we're working alongside the resilience of an ecosystem. Healthy ecosystems are food chains. And talking about coming back to the mice have their role in the system, burrowing, creating tunnels, eating various kinds of seeds and insects, all kinds of whatever's in their food diet. But they are also food for others. And there is death and life that's going to keep happening. So, for example, to say that we're not going to burn the prairie because some mice are going to die is really not a very good, deep understanding of what ecological systems are doing. We're not going out here to kill the mice. We're working at a healthier ecosystem. And that's a pretty fascinating term to think about, even in terms of leadership. Now, I'm not promoting the death of anything, really, but to recognize that we have to figure out ways that we can lead toward health. So having holistic health in systems, whether that's a biological, ecological kind of system or whether it's a human system, but even more importantly, it's the interface of both of those at the same time. So those are complex questions and raise all kinds of ethical questions that can go along with it. But if one is to take a single linear ruler approach, like ruler, 2 words there, then you probably are going to have a lot of unintended outcomes that are not healthy. So that's where we could get into the fascinating studies that I don't know a lot about, but called panarchy, where you look at the multiple facets of systems and recognize that unintended outcomes are part of what occurs there, and how can we do our best to avoid the disastrous ones.
So I'm assuming restoration has always been part of the kind of a concept of Mary Lee and the original vision, and you wove in resilience there, but then this idea of regenerative ecosystems. Like, can you maybe just weave those together a little bit further?
Well, that's where having these multiple terminologies need to be seen as complementary to each other, and to understand the extent and the limits of what each of the terms is going to contribute to the work that you're doing. The word restoration itself has a limit, because the question should be restored to what? So we don't really have the capability of restoring this to a system that has a half a mile of ice on top of us. That's a lot of refrigerant going on somewhere, and it wouldn't work anyway. So you have to pick a point in time that you feel in your study represents a healthy system. So the interactions with native peoples on this landscape is probably a pretty good indicator of what it could be like. And we know that the Miami and the Potawatomi of the region did include fire in their regimen of making sure they had healthy systems. Sometimes fire was used to actually chase game, but more so it was used as a way of knowing that we can create a healthier food system so we have better game available for us to use for food. So again, that's where the restoration has its limits, because there can be a concept that there's some perfect something out there. Well, no, there's not a perfect thing to restore to, but it's a longer term trajectory of what you're accomplishing. I remember walking this very landscape with Bill Minter and some visitors, and somebody said, "So, is it looking like what you want it to?" And you can look across here, and there's obviously signs of a pretty healthy prairie in a spring that we're seeing. And Bill said, "You know, that looks pretty good, but it's a long time after any of us are alive that this system will really be healthy." So it's on this longer term trajectory. And so for me as a leader, recognizing what I do today may not have particularly amazing results that are seen this year or next year, but I want to choose things that can have a longer term impact. I have to do the things today to be able to have that happen in the future. And others will join in the stream of working on that, because it's not just up to me to do that anyway. We also, though, do have terms like resilience. So resilience is one of those great benefits in the natural ecological systems that enable restoration to happen. In other words, to bring back life into a system where it had become fragile, or maybe it's changed to the point that it had lost its life. So resilience is a helpful factor. I am drawn probably most strongly to the concept of regeneration, though, because the gen part of it being the beginning point, and so renewal is part of that. So regenerating being a concept. It also is not implying a favoring of one thing in the system over another, but the health of the whole. I like regeneration because it has dimensions that are meaningful within the land management practices of today, and it also has meaning in spiritual theological understandings. And so letting the ecological, scientific, and the faith conversation meet around a common term is a very helpful point.
That's great.
Yeah.
Oh, and to step away from the R's for a minute too, I mean that's something with sustainability.
Yeah.
By the same token, like restoration, restoring to what? Sustainability, it's sustaining what? What is it that, are we in a dynamic, constantly evolving and changing system, or are we at something where we can entertain this idea that something is held on to or preserved?
Yeah, and an architect known for his sustainable design work reminds us that 100% less bad is not the definition of good. So regeneration helps us get there. Well, I love standing on this ridge and kind of looking out across additional landscape that all made up this upper kind of high level of this watershed that we're standing on. So you can imagine that all this water that falls on this site is making its way down into High Lake. Some of it on the east of us is making it down into Bear Lake. And we know that by having the water fall on the systems that we're working at bringing back health to, means that more water gets filtered well before it enters the lake system. The fact that we're at the headwaters of the river system, if we can have the best quality water going in there possible, that's a great thing. It benefits everything from here to Lake Michigan. And so the prairie part that we see here is obviously a key factor in it. The woodlands that are around beside us here, and then heading off down you can see some section that we've again burned this spring, and on up over the hill, that's a sand hill that has been thinned out, fires introduced on a regular basis every couple years for sure. You see kind of a savanna, and so it's a Oak Hill savanna is what we're seeing in this landscape. I, again, am just amazed to recognize that in my 22 years here, this transition from what was seen as, this is land just to be farmed, and I like farming, but to recognize that it really needed a different kind of approach to add health into the ecosystem. There are other places where we can raise various kinds of crops that will serve humanity better And for us to help make a water quality system and a land preserve in this kind of way is something that is also a very long-term legacy contribution to the future generations. Legacy is an amazing concept to think about. When one sets out to make a legacy, it can sound pretty presumptuous. It's like I have something you don't have and I'm going to do something to you. Well, that's not how I look at legacy, though. I look at legacy as something that is done together by a group of people who have a common vision that they believe benefits future generations. So I have been so blessed to have been part of caring for a legacy here at Mary Lee, stewarding it, caring for it. Because Lee and Mary Jane Reith left a legacy. They chose to buy land and invest in this kind of place, a very significant parcel. So it's not, it's over 1,000 acres, so it's not huge, but it's also significant at the same time. And so to set aside this amount of contiguous land with all these ecosystems is a way to represent into the future what kind of healthy systems we can have. So even while many of the restoration projects that we've been talking about this morning had not occurred while they were still living, we knew that that was their concept. So conservation was the term that was used a lot in the 60s and 70s. Now we use some other language today with restoration and resilience and sustainability, but that concept is a common thread that you can understand. And so when we work on this legacy of the land, we know that the energy we're putting in today is going to be here for a long time. And we can continue to have many generations of students, people of all ages, coming in and being blessed by that. So their legacy just continues on. I also find it rewarding to recognize they didn't have any children of their own, and yet they've created this blessing, benefit, enrichment to many children. And I do remember seeing Mary Jane be on site here in my early years, enjoying just watching the children who'd come for programming, and what a delight that was to her. And I often will mention to undergraduate students or graduate students that what we are doing today is part of this longer term vision. And because I knew Mary Jane personally for several years of overlap, I knew she would be excited about this, right? And so I can kind of pass on her thanks, even though she's not living anymore, to them. And I know that future leaders will be able to do the same thing because of this deeply rooted legacy concept that they planted and we can keep fostering.